Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Joshua Barnes, and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. The truce talks between Gaza and Israel are gaining momentum. However, Israel continues to strike Gaza, adding to the death toll. In such a situation, how close are we to a Gaza hostage deal, and how can it be accelerated? Is Israel's settlement expansion in the Golan Heights an attempt to seize more Syrian land? Additionally, is the threat of an ISIS revival looming after Bashar al-Assad's ouster? With Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu facing a corruption trial, what is the future of his government amid increasing calls for his resignation? Let's find out. Joining us is Daniel Rubenstein, a former advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and Naftali Bennett. He is a reservist in the Israel Defense Forces spokesperson unit. Rubenstein is also the founder of Israel Citizen Spokesperson, an organisation dedicated to promoting Israeli perspectives. In addition to his advisory roles, Rubenstein has been involved in discussions on Israeli security matters, including the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire. Thank you, Daniel Rubenstein, for joining us. My first question to you is, there have been further reports of deaths in Gaza due to Israeli strikes. Do you think it's time that Israel stopped striking Gaza?
Well, this is the situation we're dealing with. There's a group in Gaza called Hamas. It's an Arabic acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement. And this group, Hamas, was the government of Gaza on October the 7th of 2023 when it sent 3,000 men into Israel to gun down people at a music festival, to burn people in their homes, to massacre people on the roads, and begin this war that we still find ourselves in 14 months later. And also Hamas took 251 hostages. So Hamas is in Gaza, and it continues to fight Israel. It continues to attack Israelis, it continues to target Israeli soldiers, and it continues to hold hostages in its underground terror dungeons. So Israel has said that this war can only end when Hamas is dismantled as a military and government force in Gaza and when all of the hostages are home. These things have not happened yet, and therefore, unfortunately, the war continues.
How long will it take for the Gaza hostage deal to materialise, and what, according to you, can be done to hasten it?
Important to understand, why did Hamas take hostages in the first place? I think there are a few reasons that Hamas took hostages. One is to demand a ransom, which is what Hamas is doing. We call these hostage negotiations. What in effect Hamas is doing is demanding a ransom. It's demanding that mass murderers be released from Israeli prisons and released. It's a question of where these mass murderers, where these terrorists will be released to, and what their fate will be once they arrive, who will be willing to take them in. So the first reason that Hamas took hostages is to demand a ransom. And the second is insurance. Insurance against any Israeli demand that Hamas could no longer be the government of Gaza again. Hamas wants to be the government of Gaza again. It wants to be in power in Gaza because it has said that it will carry out more October 7th style massacres until Israel is destroyed. So Hamas is holding out for a deal that will allow the hostages to come home, but will see Hamas remain the power in Gaza. And we're talking a few football fields away from Israeli homes that Hamas attacked on October 7th. And the third reason is fear. It's terrifying for the families, for the people of Israel to think of their fellow citizens in underground terror dungeons for 14 months. So Hamas is applying pressure on us. And I think the only way to get to a deal, a hostage release agreement, a ransom that Hamas will accept, is if there is more pressure, not just on Hamas, but on Hamas's backers, the countries that support Hamas, specifically Qatar, Turkey, the regime in Iran. There needs to be more pressure on Hamas's backers so that Hamas can be pressured to reach a point where it will say, okay, we'll take this deal, we'll release the hostages. The Prime Minister of Israel has offered a cash reward or a payment to anyone who's holding a hostage and wants safe passage out of Gaza. So I think there is a way out, and it's that Hamas releases the hostages and accepts this safe passage in exchange for ending the war and leaving power in Gaza.
Israel's intention to expand settlements in Golan Heights has been criticised by many countries. Is this an attempt to take unilateral control of more Syrian territory?
No, let's talk about the two different areas of the Golan Heights that are being referred to. The first is the Israeli Golan Heights. When Israel became a country in 1948, our neighbor Syria did not recognize us, waged war against us, used its territory as a base for military operations against us, and diverted the water sources for the people of Israel. And in 1967, as part of a regional war that was waged against Israel, Israel took a piece of the Golan Heights that was in Syria, and it's now part of Israel since 1967, and even the United States government recognizes it as such. What we're talking about now in the context of the post-Assad Syria is who exactly is the government of Syria? Before Assad fell, the Assad regime kept an arrangement with Israel where its forces would be a safe distance away from the Israeli border so that it could never surprise Israel in another war, and UN forces would be in the middle. What happened after the fall of Assad is armed groups in Syria entered this buffer zone, attacked UN peacekeepers, and the Israeli military responded by defending these UN peacekeepers and entering this buffer zone. The big question is, if Israel leaves the buffer zone, who's going to fill it? Is a new Syrian government willing to keep the commitments of the previous one? What I'd love to see is not just a ceasefire, a piece of paper, a UN resolution. What Israel wants is peace with Syria, peace and good neighborly relations, and I hope the government of Syria and the people of Syria will choose this path rather than the path of the past century.
Is there a growing threat of an ISIS revival after Bashar al-Assad's ousting?
There is certainly a concern about which groups are making up the government of Syria. The main rebel faction that led the overthrow just recently of Bashar al-Assad is called in English HTS, and it is an umbrella organization of many different factions of groups. Some of them were offshoots of Al-Qaeda, some of them were offshoots of ISIS, so it's a huge concern. We're wondering who exactly is going to be the government of Syria, and will it be a responsible government, or will it be a government that seeks war? When I hear about a group that is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, I wonder at what year did the branch away from the main Al-Qaeda take place? It's safe to assume that anyone who is identified with Al-Qaeda in the past decade would think that the 9/11 attacks are a great thing. So I would wonder, were the 9/11 attacks a great thing? Do you agree with this? This is the kind of questions that I would have for the new government of Syria, and also about ISIS. We're concerned about the policies of the new government of Syria. Will it seek peace with its neighbors? Will it seek to maintain previous agreements? Or will it be some type of jihadist organization that wants to tear down national borders and establish some kind of Islamic state? So the concern is there. Right now, the attitude from Israel is wait and see.
How do you view Israeli-US ties under Donald Trump?
Well, I hope that there will be an improvement in US-Israel relations. The United States is the most important ally and partner of Israel. We had many areas in which we agreed in recent months and other areas where we disagreed. But there are 2 points where the incoming President Trump has filled me with a little bit more optimism than usual. The first thing was something that he published recently, which is he said that there will be, quote, all hell to pay if the hostages that Hamas is holding in its underground terror dungeons are not released by the time he is inaugurated. This includes a number of American citizens whom Hamas is holding. It's an indication to me that perhaps the incoming president will be more willing to pressure Hamas's patrons, such as Qatar and Turkey, to do the right thing and pressure Hamas to end the war that it started 14 months ago. And the second thing that I'm looking at with a dose of optimism, although we have to be careful about this in the Middle East, is that Trump has called for maximum pressure on the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime has been attacking Israel for the past 14 months on 7 different fronts. It's the Iranian regime that supports the proxy armies that have been attacking Israel, such as Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi pirates in Yemen. So the Iranian regime is behind all of these groups. The Iranian regime has devoted vast sums of money that it has stolen from the Iranian people in order to fund these wars against Israel, because the Iranian regime is ideologically committed to the destruction of Israel. And at the same time, the Iranian regime is developing the capability to build a nuclear bomb. This is a huge concern that if the regime that believes in the destruction of Israel and calls for the destruction of Israel acquires the means to destroy Israel, we're a very small country, that this is a red line that must be stopped before it becomes a reality. So the fact that incoming President Trump has called for maximum pressure on the Iranian regime is, I think, a very positive thing.
What do you think the fate of Benjamin Netanyahu's government is going to be amid his corruption trial in court?
It's difficult to predict. The Israeli electorate right now is quite divided between those who support Netanyahu and those who oppose Netanyahu. The legal proceedings against the prime minister is something that is going to take a lot of time. It may be drawn out. In the meantime, Prime Minister Netanyahu does appear to enjoy a comfortable parliamentary majority that will remain a parliamentary majority until the next elections in Israel. But in the parliamentary system, things can be difficult to predict. Something could happen in the news. One of the parties in the parliament could disagree strongly with the policies of the prime minister and could leave the parliament and force an election. But at the moment, it looks like the prime minister will remain the prime minister, and his legal proceedings will take a bit more time to pan out.
Do you think that Netanyahu's government is unstable amid protests for him to step down?
In recent weeks, the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has actually become more stable because he has added a party to his governing coalition that was once sitting in the opposition. That party is called the New Hope Party. It was a small party, but it was an offshoot of the ruling Likud party. It's led by Gidon Sar, who was formerly a leader in the Likud party, a minister in the government in previous governments. So the Prime Minister Netanyahu has added one of his opponents to his own governing coalition, which gives him a little bit more breathing room if there are other members of parliament who may disagree with policies in the future. So it's looking actually like the Prime Minister's current government is more stable than it was. But again, in the Israeli system, in the parliamentary system, something could happen tomorrow that could change this calculation.
Is there strong support for Netanyahu's law reforms in the country? How could this change the course of the judiciary system in Israel?
The legal reforms that some members of the ruling Likud party are proposing are quite divisive. There is a strong divide on how the public feels about this. On the one hand, the ruling party says that the Israeli Supreme Court is far too powerful and that it has taken powers upon itself that it just devised for itself and it needs to be reined in. On the other hand, the opponents of this idea that the Supreme Court needs to be reined in will say that the proposals for reining in the Supreme Court actually give far too much power to the parliament and in effect give far too much power to the ruling political party. And the opponents of the initiative would say that the ruling party in Israel will in effect control the parliament, control the government, and be able to choose the judges of the Supreme Court. And that's far too much power. The state of Israel today does not have a constitution that clearly delineates what are the powers to be divided between the parliament and the judiciary and the executive branch. And since we do not have a constitution, we also do not have an agreed upon method for changing what would be a constitutional system. And some of these changes, which could be in other countries, require a much longer parliamentary process at the state level, at the federal level. In Israel, they can be implemented with a majority vote. So there is a lot of division right now on the future of what the Israeli political system will be and what the balance of power will be. But I think most of the Israeli public right now is still focused on the war that we find ourselves in on 7 fronts, with Hamas in Gaza, with the hostages still in Gaza. And most of us are going to be focused on the war rather than changes to our political system.
The Israeli foreign minister has called Ireland's premier anti-Semitic. Australia recently saw an attack on a synagogue. How do you react to activities taking place in different parts of the world, and why is it becoming more frequent?
Since the October 7th massacre last year in 2023, there has been a surge in anti-Semitism around the world, and this surge began immediately after the massacre on October 8th. You saw in cities around the world, in the United States, people filling the streets in support of Hamas. So there are many people who saw the October 7th massacre not as a crime, but as an opportunity to reveal their long-standing hatreds against the Jewish people and their place in society. Now, what's happening in many countries around the world, there is an increase in distrust among the local population. There is lack of trust between the people and the governments. There is increasing polarization. And whenever you have a society that is not well, it's very common that that society will project its own angers onto its Jewish population, whether it has one domestically or abroad. You will find that whatever the ills are in the world, that the Jewish people will be identified as being associated with those. So we're in the middle of not just a seven-front war here in Israel, but Jewish people around the world are also facing increasing hostility by people who saw the October 7th massacre as an opportunity. And the only response that we can have to this is to be vigilant, to encourage governments in all countries around the world to crack down on this anti-Semitic violence and incitement, and to stand with Israel as Israel is fighting for its life in a seven-front war against the Iranian regime and its proxy armies.
Thank you, Daniel Rubenstein, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode. For more international news updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.